What if I told you that buried deep in the Appalachian Mountains lies a story so disturbing, so shrouded in secrecy that even the FBI tried to erase it from public memory? Imagine a weathered farmhouse, its wooden beams groaning under the weight of 3 generations of silence. Locals whisper about the Blackwood name, but most refuse to say it out loud. They claim it's just folklore, a ghost story to scare young boys from wandering too far into the woods. But the truth? The truth is far worse. Because behind those rotting walls, a single man built his own twisted empire, a closed world where his word was law, his sons were pawns, and his obsession with purity reshaped an entire bloodline. What began in 1903 with the purchase of 500 remote acres grew into one of America's darkest, most secretive family legacies, one that still casts a shadow today. And once you hear the full story, you'll never look at the word family the same way again. Before we dive deeper, if stories like this grip you the way they grip me, consider hitting that subscribe button. It's the easiest way to join me as we uncover more hidden histories and forgotten truths. And if you find this case as chilling as I do, give this video a like. It really helps get the story out to more people who need to hear it. The mountains of West Virginia hold many secrets, but none as chilling as the tale of Thomas Blackwood. His story begins in 1903, when he appeared almost from nowhere with pockets full of untraceable cash. He purchased nearly 500 acres of rugged wilderness, the kind of land so isolated that neighbors were measured in miles, not footsteps. Locals barely noticed, except to remark that the man seemed determined to disappear from the world. County clerks processed his land deeds and muttered among themselves. The sum was twice the asking price, offered without hesitation. No questions were permitted about his origins. Silence was part of the bargain. A witness later described him as intimidating, a tall figure with piercing eyes that seemed to silence a room without words. He carried himself like a preacher and a soldier combined, commanding respect and unease in equal measure. From the moment his boots touched Appalachian soil, Thomas radiated control. He declared that modern society was corrupt, that cities rotted men from within. He vowed his family would be purified through separation, untouched by outside temptation. Within months, a massive 2-story farmhouse rose from the wilderness. Timber was hauled, stone was cut, and iron stoves somehow reached the ridge without a single laborer reported by locals. Only Thomas appeared in town, always alone. General store ledgers still show his purchases, loads so heavy they should have required 4 or 5 men to carry. Yet, no one ever saw assistance. Some whispered he had sons hidden, trained to obey without question. Postal records confirm he subscribed to multiple newspapers, but refused official mail requiring signatures. He demanded privacy with almost fanatical precision. Deliverymen claimed they heard muffled voices from the house, but none were permitted closer than the property edge. One postman's journal entry still chills historians. He wrote of delivering a package one spring morning, only to hear unmistakable sobbing from the barn. When questioned, Thomas claimed it was livestock. The postman doubted him deeply. Though suspicion lingered, no man acted. In these hills, privacy carried weight heavier than suspicion. Neighbors knew something felt wrong, but West Virginia was a land where men minded their own business, especially with powerful personalities. That silence allowed Thomas to cultivate something unseen. His homestead grew into a fortress of secrecy, a place where men dared not tread. Outsiders avoided the road altogether, muttering about strange sounds rising through the trees at night. The Blackwood household remained hidden behind its walls, but whispers started to leak. A local physician, Dr. Samuel Porter, recorded his first visit in 1908. What he saw etched itself into his memory forever. The summons arrived during a snowstorm. He expected to deliver a farmer's wife. Instead, inside the dim farmhouse, he found a young man, barely of age, writhing in agony, already scarred by something far beyond normal hardship. His trembling when Thomas entered the room spoke louder than words. Porter noted terror in his eyes, not relief. And outside that door, he glimpsed 6 other young figures, silent, pale, carrying burdens no youth should bear. The physician attempted questions. Thomas shut him down with icy authority, reminding him his duty was to treat, not to pry. Porter complied but left unsettled. His notes warned that something unnatural ruled within those walls. A deputy later visited, but his report was pitifully short. 3 sentences, claiming no distress. The truth. Thomas had already spread money into political pockets, buying silence. Men in power preferred his contributions to confrontation. This was the seed of something darker than isolation. Thomas did not merely want distance from the world, he wanted dominion over blood itself. And no one, not doctor nor sheriff, was willing to interfere. The first outsider to stumble too close was a hunter named Jonas Miller. In 1910, while tracking deer, he found a hidden burial ground marked with rough crosses. 11 graves, some heartbreakingly small. He reported it. The sheriff dismissed him coldly. "A man buries his kin on his own land. That's his right," he allegedly said. Jonas returned home uneasy, forever haunted by those tiny, unmarked mounds hidden beneath mountain brush. For the community, excuses flowed easily. Some claimed religious rights, others claimed respect for privacy, and many, it seemed, feared Thomas's unpredictable temper, which was rumored to flare like fire without warning. Yet the truth was beginning to leak through cracks in the silence. By 1911, a young boy named Elias encountered Thomas's youngest son near a stream. The boy begged him for books, any books, then vanished back into the woods. That boy's letters, smuggled later to a Bible salesman, revealed glimpses of the horror inside. He described rituals, a special room, and the relentless commands of his father, who insisted God demanded purity of blood. It was the first testimony that Thomas had built not merely a household, but a doctrine. He preached isolation, sacrifice, and blood purity with the same conviction as a frontier prophet. And his sons paid the price. When authorities finally stirred, they arrived too late. By the time a state investigator crossed the threshold in 1915, the Blackwood farmhouse was empty. The family was gone, vanished into the wilderness like ghosts. What remained was enough to confirm the rumors. The so-called special room still bore disturbing signs. Handwritten texts scrawled across the walls, a bed draped in white, and journals filled with obsessive notes about lineage and superior offspring. In the cellar, investigators found Thomas's wife, shackled and broken, a shell of a man who once resisted, punished with years of confinement. His voice, when he could speak, carried only fragments of prayers and defeat. The discoveries confirmed suspicions. This was not isolation, but indoctrination. Thomas sought to create a dynasty of his own making, bound by fear, secrecy, and blood. It was a mission he planned to outlive himself. What disturbed investigators most was the scale. He had already purchased properties under other names in Tennessee, Kentucky, and North Carolina. His doctrine was not confined to one farmhouse. It was spreading like a sickness through hidden branches. Witnesses later described the journals in detail. Schedules, breeding plans, notes on which pairings produced healthier children, and chillingly clinical descriptions of his own sons being prepared for roles in his twisted vision. The farmhouse burned down years later, but its shadow lingered. Locals whispered of figures glimpsed in the woods, of strangers who spoke strangely, of children who never attended school yet appeared suddenly in town before vanishing again. For the first time, Westland County faced the reality that silence had sheltered a predator. But by then, it was too late. Thomas had disappeared, and with him, the foundation of an empire rooted in secrecy. Even decades later, when federal agents reopened the case, they found only fragments, maps, journals, whispers of hidden communities. The man himself had vanished into history, leaving behind generations warped by his obsession. The Blackwood story begins with land deeds and whispered rumors, but its legacy is far darker. It is the tale of how one man twisted faith, blood, and silence into tools of absolute control. And as investigators traced his path, they realized something even more unsettling. This was not a story about a single family. It was about how easily a community can choose not to see evil when it lives next door. For every man who looked away, every deputy who ignored reports, every neighbor who stayed silent, Thomas gained strength. Silence was his greatest weapon, and it was gifted to him freely by those who feared discomfort. The truth was buried not only beneath the soil of West Virginia, but within the pride of men who valued privacy above justice. And that decision allowed a legacy of darkness to take root. The Blackwood legacy began with one man's delusion and an entire county's silence. It began with money slipped into pockets, with frightened neighbors averting their gaze, with officials writing short reports to save themselves trouble. And it began with sons trapped in a house they could not escape, raised in shadows, their futures bound to a twisted doctrine they never chose. Sons who would carry forward something far more dangerous than isolation. For when Thomas disappeared into the hills, he carried with him not just his followers but his doctrine, his belief in purity, his mission to outlast death. A mission that history would struggle to contain. Thus, the foundation was laid. Not in a courthouse or a church, but in a secluded farmhouse where a father declared himself prophet. A place where silence became law and blood became destiny. The Blackwood story does not begin in mystery. It begins in plain sight with land records, neighbors' accounts, and officials' silence. Its roots are historical fact, preserved in documents men once tried desperately to bury. But as we step further into this story, remember this. It all began with a single man in 1903, standing on Appalachian soil, determined to create a world in his own image. And disturbingly, he succeeded. The Blackwood property, already shrouded in unease, grew even more mysterious as years passed. Men delivering goods recalled strange encounters. They claimed voices echoed from the house, yet no one other than Thomas ever appeared. A delivery man once swore he heard footsteps darting inside when Thomas stepped outside to collect supplies. The movements were swift, deliberate, like trained soldiers obeying silent commands. Yet the faces remained hidden, concealed behind shuttered windows. Neighbors spoke of strange lights flickering through trees late at night. They described sounds resembling chanting, guttural murmurs carried by the wind. The mountains were no stranger to prayer, but this sounded different, darker, more commanding. Men hunting in nearby woods reported hearing cries. Some dismissed it as coyotes, others whispered it was human, low, pained wails that sent them retreating quickly, unwilling to confront whatever was unfolding beyond that farmhouse. The community grew accustomed to secrecy. Few dared speak publicly. Those who mentioned it were often warned away. "That's Blackwood's land," they were told. "Best leave him alone. He doesn't take kindly to visitors." The silence was reinforced by Thomas's generosity. His heavy donations to church projects and the sheriff's campaign fund earned him protection. Men in authority suddenly found no reason to ask uncomfortable questions about his affairs. But unease spread privately. Farmers spoke in hushed tones at taverns, describing how Thomas hauled impossible loads alone, carrying cast-iron stoves on his wagon without assistance. They wondered how a single man could manage such feats. Some concluded he had hidden helpers, perhaps sons raised in secrecy, trained to obey without question. The thought disturbed them, but curiosity was never strong enough to overcome fear of Thomas's reputation and his fierce gaze. Even the postman, who suspected foul play, confessed his reluctance. He described the farmhouse as heavy with dread, the kind of silence that presses against your chest. He admitted he dreaded every delivery route near that land. Then came the physician's reports, sealed for decades. Dr. Samuel Porter's notes spoke not of a wife in labor, but a son trembling during childbirth, already scarred by something unspeakable, watched closely by brothers equally broken. He wrote of Thomas looming over the boy during treatment, a presence that drained the air from the room. The boy's eyes revealed fear, not comfort. Porter left certain that something unnatural ruled that household, yet his warnings went unheeded. The deputy filed a dismissive report protecting his benefactor's image. Official silence gave Thomas more room to act, allowing him to continue whatever rituals unfolded behind closed doors. Then, in autumn 1910, a hunter stumbled across the crude cemetery hidden in brush. 11 graves stood in silence, unmarked except for dates carved on wooden crosses. Some were clearly for children, heartbreakingly small. The hunter reported his discovery. The sheriff brushed him off, claiming a man had rights to bury his kin on his own land. The graves became another secret swallowed by silence, ignored by those in power. Still, whispers carried. Men exchanged uneasy glances when Thomas appeared in town. He rarely spoke more than necessary, always collecting supplies briskly before vanishing back into the mountains. His presence commanded silence, his absence bred rumor. It was a traveling Bible salesman who accidentally pierced the veil further. By chance, he met one of Thomas's sons at a creek. The boy was pale, skittish, desperate to talk, desperate to be heard. The boy begged him for books, any kind, but demanded secrecy. They arranged to leave writings hidden beneath a rock formation, exchanged without words. Over weeks, scraps of testimony emerged, painting a horrifying picture of life inside. The boy wrote of a special room in the East Wing, where sons were brought once they reached a certain age. He described prayers twisted into commands, ceremonies that bent faith into something unrecognizable. He revealed that Thomas had convinced them the outside world was poisoned, filled with sin. Only their bloodline, kept pure and unbroken, could withstand the coming apocalypse. It was doctrine, not suggestion. It was law. The boy wrote of brothers forced into roles they did not understand, commanded to serve divine purpose. He confessed his terror of Thomas's gaze, his dread of the day he too would be summoned. His letters described fear that clung to every corner of the house. Men moved in silence, trained to obey, conditioned to tremble whenever Thomas's footsteps echoed. They were soldiers in a war they never chose. One letter chilled the salesman most. The boy wrote, "Father says when my nephew comes of age, he will begin. The bloodline must continue, no matter what happens to father." The cycle was already planned. The salesman, horrified, promised to alert authorities. But he hesitated, fearing the local sheriff was compromised. He kept the letters, waiting for proof. But soon, the boy vanished. The secret exchanges ended suddenly, without explanation. The truth of the letters confirmed suspicions long whispered, but never proven. Behind the farmhouse walls was not only abuse, but indoctrination, a self-perpetuating system meant to outlast Thomas's own lifetime. Meanwhile, community excuses hardened. Men dismissed rumors as superstition, unwilling to confront the monstrous possibility. Others claimed religious liberty. Many simply accepted donations or feared Thomas too deeply to act against him. Silence was easier, yet unease lingered. Hunters still reported cries in the woods. Delivery men still heard muffled voices. Even neighbors who avoided the property swore the air seemed heavier when passing near the Blackwood Ridge. The whispers spread beyond Westland County. State investigators began hearing fragments of testimony: a strange family in the hills, a patriarch with dangerous influence, unsettling reports ignored by local officials. The silence was beginning to crack. When state investigator James Morrison finally entered the case, he described the atmosphere surrounding Blackwood as deliberate blindness. Communities had built walls of excuses, but the truth leaked steadily, refusing to remain buried forever. Whispers had become more than rumor. They became evidence of systemic silence, a reminder that darkness grows not only through cruelty, but through the complicity of those who choose not to see. By then, Thomas's influence stretched far beyond his property. The whispers revealed not simply a man, but a doctrine that twisted religion into chains, binding his sons into roles meant to carry his vision forward. It was a doctrine built in shadows, protected by fear, enforced by silence, and every whisper carried weight, pulling outsiders closer to the truth, exposing a darkness far larger than any one farmhouse. The whispers themselves became a kind of testimony, fragments left behind by men who dared to speak in taverns, hunters who stumbled into secrets, and one desperate boy who risked everything for a chance at freedom. Though scattered and fragile, these voices survived. They were the first cracks in Thomas's fortress, the first signs that the silence shielding him might one day shatter. Yet for now, his reign remained unbroken. The whispers proved something crucial, that the Blackwood story was not isolated to rumor. It was real, breathing, and still unfolding. And though many chose silence, a few fragments of truth slipped through. Those fragments were enough to show the world a glimpse of what lay hidden, enough to suggest that Thomas was not just a reclusive man, but a dangerous architect of generational control. Every whisper deepened the dread surrounding the Blackwood name. Each one reminded men that isolation, when combined with power, could twist into something monstrous. And still the farmhouse stood, its windows shut, its secrets intact. The whispers of the shadows did not yet topple Thomas's empire, but they lit a trail for investigators to follow, a trail that would soon lead into the heart of his terrifying doctrine. The story of Blackwood was no longer confined to the farmhouse. It lived in the murmurs of hunters, in the scribbled words of a frightened boy, in the uneasy silence of a community too afraid to see. And as those whispers multiplied, so too did the realization. The shadows held not just secrets of the past, but warnings of a legacy still expanding, preparing to outlive the man who created it. The Blackwood story might have remained hidden forever if not for the fragile courage of a young son desperate for escape. His secret letters, written with trembling hands, exposed the unthinkable truth. The boy's words, smuggled out through a Bible salesman, revealed a household unlike any other. His father was not simply a farmer, but a self-declared prophet who claimed to carry divine revelation. Each letter dripped with fear, yet carried just enough detail to suggest the scale of the horror. He described brothers beaten into silence, trained to obey commands disguised as scripture. He wrote of a special room in the East Wing, a chamber his father claimed was sacred. Sons were brought there when they came of age, forced to fulfill duties beyond comprehension. The boy confessed he dreaded his turn. He described trembling whenever Thomas's footsteps approached. He knew what awaited him because he had already seen what became of his older brothers. The letters painted Thomas not as a recluse, but as a man obsessed with blood purity. He believed the apocalypse loomed, and only his unbroken bloodline could inherit the earth. According to the boy, Thomas preached nightly sermons. He twisted scripture, inserting his own verses, his own commandments. Brothers were reminded they were chosen, that sacrifice was holy, that obedience was their destiny. The salesman who received the letters struggled to comprehend. Each page was soaked with desperation. The boy begged not only for books, but for salvation, for someone, anyone, to intervene before it was too late. One letter described the hidden cemetery. The boy confessed he had buried infants there with his brothers. They were children born of the doctrine, too frail to survive, returned to the soil in silence. Another revealed Thomas's obsession with journals. He recorded everything, schedules, rituals, and calculations about which sons might prove strongest. The boy claimed his father referred to him as a specimen, not a son. He described nights when the house filled with chanting. Thomas demanded his sons kneel before him, declaring that God had chosen their family to cleanse humanity. Dissent was punished brutally, obedience rewarded with scraps of affection. One chilling detail emerged repeatedly. Thomas spoke often of generations to come. He declared his grandsons would continue the work. The boy realized this nightmare was not meant to end with them. It was designed to spread. The salesman, horrified, preserved each letter carefully. He knew the local sheriff was compromised, already in Thomas's pocket. He debated going directly to state authorities, but hesitated, fearing disbelief and ridicule. Still, he kept receiving the letters. The boy described his plan to escape during spring, when they were allowed brief ventures for water. He promised to leave evidence hidden for the salesman to retrieve. But one day, the letters simply stopped. Weeks passed with silence. The rock formation where they exchanged notes remained empty. The salesman waited, then finally realized something terrible had happened inside that farmhouse. Later investigation suggested Thomas had discovered the correspondence. Some speculated the boy was silenced. Others believed he was forced deeper into submission. Whatever the case, his words ended, leaving only fragments of testimony behind. Yet those fragments mattered. They offered the first clear evidence of the indoctrination within the Blackwood household. They proved Thomas had built not just a family, but a cult of obedience wrapped in false divinity. Investigators decades later would call the letters the forgotten testimony. They were unsigned, fragile, written in uneven script, but they revealed truths no official report had dared record. They humanized the shadows behind the farmhouse walls. The boy's descriptions of his father were haunting. He wrote of eyes that never blinked, of a voice that filled rooms with dread, of a presence so overwhelming it felt like a physical weight pressing down. He admitted he once loved his father, before fear consumed everything. Thomas had twisted paternal authority into divine decree, convincing sons their very existence depended on obedience to his vision. The letters also hinted at rebellion. The boy spoke of whispered conversations with younger brothers, dreams of running away, visions of life beyond the hills. But always, those dreams collapsed under the crushing weight of fear. In one particularly heartbreaking passage, he confessed, "I sometimes forget my own voice. We do not laugh here. We do not choose. We only wait for Father's command." His words carried the silence of captivity. The letters described a cycle of control so complete it extended beyond the grave. Even in death, sons remained bound to the doctrine. Burials were conducted with ritual chants, reinforcing the belief that they served divine purpose. The salesman, burdened with knowledge, eventually traveled to Charleston to report the letters. But by then, years had passed, and Thomas had already relocated. The testimony was filed, then buried beneath jurisdictional disputes. Decades later, historians rediscovered the letters in state archives. By then, the boy's name was long lost, but his words remained, preserved as haunting echoes of a life consumed by shadows. The letters revealed the Blackwood case was not about isolation alone. It was about systematic indoctrination, a closed world where faith was weaponized, fear was cultivated, and blood became the only law that mattered. They also demonstrated the power of silence. For every desperate page the boy wrote, dozens of men in positions of power looked away, unwilling to confront what those words truly meant. And yet, the letters outlived them all. They carried across time, whispering the truth that Thomas tried to bury. They proved that even the most carefully hidden secrets eventually find a way to speak. The boy's courage gave investigators their first real insight into the Blackwood household. His words broke through the silence, even if only faintly, illuminating the shadows just enough to reveal the scale of horror. Without the letters, Thomas might have remained a rumor. With them, he became something undeniable. A man who turned family into prisoners, who cloaked abuse in scripture, who plotted a bloodline designed to endure centuries. The tragedy, of course, was that the boy's voice was silenced before he could escape. His fate remains unknown. Perhaps he died in that farmhouse. Perhaps he carried the doctrine forward unwillingly, but his testimony lingers. Each letter carries weight not only for what it says, but for what it represents. The voice of a son trying to pierce through generations of silence and fear. In many ways, the letters are the most human piece of the Blackwood case. They strip away myth and legend, exposing raw suffering, raw desperation, and the quiet courage of a boy who dared to speak. Through those fragile words, the forgotten boy became immortal. His voice continues to echo, reminding us that even in the darkest prisons, men search for a way to be heard, a way to be free. And though his plan failed, though his words ended abruptly, their survival proves something Thomas never anticipated. His sons were not merely vessels of his doctrine, they were human beings, capable of resistance, capable of truth. The letters remind us that silence can shield monsters, but testimony can break walls. They remain a testament to the fact that even in forgotten corners, the truth finds a way to endure. The Blackwood legacy would spread across states, infecting generations. But at its heart, the boy's voice remains, whispering across history, reminding us that behind every statistic, every case file, was a human life yearning for freedom. Those letters, fragile and unsigned, ensure the Blackwood case is never reduced to myth. They are the voice of the forgotten, the proof that even the most silenced sons left behind a record of truth. And it is through those forgotten words that the world first glimpsed the depth of Thomas Blackwood's empire. An empire not built of stone or steel, but of obedience, indoctrination, and the stolen lives of his sons. By 1915, whispers had spread too widely to ignore. State authorities, pressured by fragments of testimony and mounting rumors, finally authorized an investigation into the Blackwood property. What they found, forever, altered the course of this case. Investigator James Morrison led the team. A meticulous man, he carried notebooks filled with careful details. He had heard the rumors: strange graves, secret rooms, trembling sons hidden away. Still, nothing prepared him for what lay ahead. When Morrison arrived, the farmhouse stood eerily silent. The snow had settled around it like a shroud. Doors hung half open, windows cracked. The house felt abandoned, as though its occupants had fled in haste. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Rooms appeared lived in yet hastily vacated. Clothes were scattered, meals left unfinished. Morrison realized the family had vanished only weeks before his arrival. The timing was unsettling. The first thing his team noticed was the rigid organization. Every section of the house was divided with precision. A west wing reserved for Thomas, a dormitory-style south wing for his sons, and a nursery to the north. The nursery contained 11 beds of varying sizes. The sight disturbed Morrison deeply. The beds were arranged in military fashion, blankets folded with exact care, as though the children were soldiers in training rather than sons. But the most unsettling discovery was the locked chamber in the east wing. Behind a reinforced door, investigators found a room covered in handwritten texts. The words claimed to be scripture, but bore no resemblance to any known Bible. The walls were scrawled with verses proclaiming blood purity, divine lineage, and commands for obedience. At the center stood a crude altar, a leather-bound journal resting atop it, its pages filled with Thomas's careful handwriting. That journal was damning. Spanning 12 years, it chronicled a breeding program Thomas called God's Great Experiment. He tracked fertility, recorded pairings, and analyzed outcomes as though his sons were livestock, not human beings. Even more disturbing were his plans for the future. He wrote of training his grandsons to continue his doctrine, ensuring that the bloodline never diluted, ensuring his influence persisted long after his death. Morrison realized this was not a man's diary. It was a manifesto. Each page revealed a calculated effort to construct a dynasty built not on love, but on fear, control, and manipulation of blood itself. The cellar revealed an even more horrifying sight. Hidden behind a false wall, investigators discovered Thomas's wife chained to a beam. Malnourished and broken, he had been imprisoned for 7 years, barely sustained by scraps. When questioned, he spoke in fragments. He muttered that Thomas claimed it was God's will. He said the sons stopped crying after the first year. His voice was weak, carrying the weight of years of torment. Morrison recorded that encounter with chilling precision. The wife was more specter than man, reduced to a shell by captivity. His testimony confirmed Thomas had begun his doctrine before they even settled in West Virginia. The cellar also bore scratch marks along the walls, evidence of desperate attempts to escape. Investigators realized the man had been subjected to prolonged sensory deprivation, left to rot while his sons were molded into Thomas's vision. Despite these discoveries, no trace of Thomas or his sons remained. They had disappeared into the wilderness, vanishing like smoke. Searches combed the surrounding hills, but yielded only the crude cemetery with 17 graves. Soil analysis revealed some of the burials were recent. The graves bore no names, only dates. The implication was grim. Children had been born and died even during the years authorities delayed their intervention. The community's complicity became undeniable. Morrison documented payments Thomas made to sheriffs, commissioners, and influential locals. Men who should have acted instead shielded him. Silence had not been accidental. It had been purchased. Morrison's official report, classified for decades, described the Blackwood property as a fortress of indoctrination. He concluded that Thomas's doctrine was designed not only to survive, but to multiply, spreading far beyond a single household. The search of nearby counties revealed additional land deeds under aliases. Each property carried signs of preparation, cabins, hidden caches of supplies, and journals outlining plans for relocation. Thomas had built a network to scatter his doctrine. The most chilling evidence came in the form of maps. They marked routes across state lines with annotations about sons ready for duty. Morrison realized Thomas had already begun planting branches of his bloodline elsewhere. Though the farmhouse was empty, its silence screamed volumes. Every object, every note, every bed carried evidence of a system designed for obedience and continuity. It was less a home than a training ground. The collapse of silence revealed not just one man's madness, but an entire structure propped up by fear and neglect. Officials had ignored the signs for years, enabling a system that grew stronger with every passing season. The FBI would later call this moment the true turning point, the collapse of silence. What began as whispers and rumors finally became undeniable fact. The Blackwood case was no longer folklore. It was documented history. Journalists attempted to publish the findings, but local resistance remained fierce. Many men in the community resented outsiders prying into their affairs. Some threatened violence if investigators continued to expose the truth. Still, Morrison's report circulated among higher authorities. It revealed a level of organization rare in cases of familial abuse. Thomas had not only controlled his household, he had created a framework to ensure his legacy endured. The collapse of silence forced a reckoning. Men who once dismissed the rumors as superstition had to face the fact that their silence allowed Thomas's empire to thrive. The guilt would linger in the county for generations. But Thomas himself remained elusive. Despite manhunts and warrants, no trace of him surfaced. Some believed he fled westward. Others whispered he never left the hills, living under a new name among isolated kin. The case remained open, unresolved. Yet the evidence uncovered at the farmhouse left no doubt about the depth of the horror. It proved that silence and neglect could transform one man's delusion into a generational nightmare. The locked chamber, the journals, the chained wife, all stood as monuments to how far indoctrination could twist reality. They showed how a father could crown himself prophet and enslave his own blood in service of madness. The collapse of silence was both revelation and tragedy. It exposed the truth, yet arrived too late to rescue the sons who had already vanished into Thomas's shadow. Their fates became another haunting unknown. For historians, this moment is crucial. It represents the line where myth became evidence, where whispers turned into reports, and where the community's silence collapsed under the sheer weight of undeniable discovery. But even then, the story did not end. The silence collapsed in West Virginia. Yes, but Thomas had already prepared for continuity. His bloodline, scattered and hidden, was ready to continue his twisted vision elsewhere. The farmhouse fell into ruin, eventually burning down, but its memory lingered. It became a symbol of negligence and fear, a warning of what happens when men choose comfort over confrontation, silence over justice. The collapse of silence was not the end of the Blackwood case. It was the beginning of a larger pursuit. It revealed that Thomas's empire was not contained. It was expanding, mutating, preparing to outlive him. And though Morrison documented everything he found, he admitted one terrifying truth in his private notes. We have uncovered only a fraction. The rest remains hidden in hills, carried by sons we cannot find. Thus, the silence ended, but the legacy endured. The truth was revealed, but the horror remained unfinished. The collapse was not resolution. It was a door opening onto an even darker horizon. What lay beyond that horizon would shock investigators for decades. For Thomas had planted seeds too deeply to be uprooted by one investigation. His doctrine had already spread, taking root in places far from Westland County. And so, the collapse of silence marked the moment the Blackwood case transformed. It was no longer a local scandal. It became a regional plague, a generational nightmare echoing across multiple states, hidden in plain sight. The farmhouse stood empty, but its echoes carried. Every creaking beam, every scrawled wall, every abandoned journal testified to the enormity of what had been built there. The silence had collapsed, but the darkness persisted. The collapse of silence was both victory and defeat. It brought the truth into daylight, but revealed a truth so vast, so horrifying, that daylight itself seemed inadequate to contain its shadows. And in that uneasy light, investigators realized they had not stopped Thomas Blackwood. They had only glimpsed the machinery of his doctrine, a machine designed to keep turning long after his disappearance into the hills. When investigators uncovered Thomas Blackwood's journals, they realized the nightmare extended far beyond a single farmhouse. What lay within those pages proved his intentions had always been larger than Westland County. He envisioned an empire. The journals referenced properties scattered across multiple states, cabins built under false names, hidden routes mapped with care, and supplies stockpiled in preparation. Thomas had planted seeds of his doctrine far wider than anyone dared imagine. By the 1940s, federal agents began tracing his movements. Safety deposit boxes revealed maps, false identities, and chilling letters boasting of his divine lineage, spreading undetected. Each document confirmed the bloodline was never meant to end. Authorities eventually uncovered entire communities tied to his vision. In Tennessee, Kentucky, and North Carolina, men lived in isolation, bound to the same rules, convinced they carried the last pure blood on earth. These communities were not accidents. They were deliberate colonies established by Thomas through his sons and grandsons. Each settlement carried the same hallmarks: secrecy, indoctrination, and rituals enforcing loyalty to his doctrine. When agents raided these sites, they discovered generations raised to believe the outside world was corrupt. The men within these compounds had never known freedom. They had only known Blackwood's law, passed down like scripture. Medical examinations revealed the toll of generations of inbreeding. Many descendants suffered from physical abnormalities, cognitive impairments, and congenital disorders. The damage was visible, the direct result of a doctrine that placed purity above survival. Yet even amid the suffering, the indoctrination remained strong. Some sons insisted they were chosen, repeating Thomas's words decades after his disappearance. They clung to his promises of an apocalypse only they would survive. In 1946, 73 living descendants were rescued from Blackwood compounds. Some were too damaged to live independently. Others required years of rehabilitation before they could grasp the concept of a world beyond their father's shadow. But even then, not all were saved. Several communities resisted. Some sons vanished deeper into wilderness, carrying journals and rituals with them. Authorities realized they had not dismantled the network. They had only disrupted fragments of it. The bloodline proved more resilient than expected. Interviews revealed Thomas had spoken of branches scattered across America. Each branch was instructed to remain hidden, unaware of the others, ensuring the doctrine survived even if one community collapsed. This decentralized structure made the network nearly impossible to eradicate. Wherever one settlement was discovered, rumors surfaced of another elsewhere. Blackwood's doctrine had metastasized, spreading like a sickness no authority could fully contain. Investigators documented chilling testimonies. Sons described being told since childhood that their purpose was continuation. They had no identities beyond their role as vessels of blood purity. Their very existence was bound to the doctrine. Some survivors, when rehabilitated, admitted they still feared Thomas's return. They described him as larger than life, convinced he had not died but merely gone into hiding, watching from the shadows, waiting to reclaim them. Others revealed darker truths. They spoke of grandsons already trained to lead, prepared to enforce the doctrine even after Thomas's disappearance. His plan had worked. Authority passed seamlessly to younger men indoctrinated from birth. The FBI closed the case in 1960, labeling Thomas presumed dead. But privately, many agents admitted unease. Too many settlements remained undiscovered. Too many journals hinted at branches scattered far beyond official records. The 1970s brought disturbing confirmation. Reports surfaced of isolated groups in Oregon and Arizona, men living in secrecy with unusual genetic disorders. Their rituals and teachings mirrored Thomas's writings almost exactly. The bloodline had reached west. One survivor chillingly recalled his grandfather's words. "There are many of us. One day we will reunite, carrying the mark." Investigators dismissed it as indoctrination, but the implication haunted them. Multiple branches still existed. By the 1990s, genetic testing revealed Blackwood markers in hundreds of individuals across Appalachia. Most had no knowledge of their origins, several generations removed. But clusters suggested isolated groups continued the doctrine long into modern times. In 2005, a raid in Idaho uncovered a compound of 37 men and boys. Their leader called himself Thomas Shepard. Genetic tests confirmed him as a great-grandson of the original patriarch. The doctrine was alive. Shepard carried a handwritten copy of Blackwood's religious teachings, word for word. He claimed divine revelation, yet investigators recognized Thomas's familiar script. The vision of purity had not only survived, it had flourished under new leaders. This discovery reignited fears that Thomas's empire had never truly ended. Instead, it had fractured into countless offshoots, each branch believing it was the chosen continuation, each raising sons to preserve the doctrine. Medical officials documented extensive genetic damage among Shepard's group. Yet despite suffering, loyalty remained unshaken. The indoctrination was too strong, proving Blackwood's psychological chains were more enduring than physical ones. By 2015, a confidential registry documented over 300 confirmed descendants carrying Blackwood's markers across 27 states. Some had integrated into society unknowingly. Others clung to isolation, still practicing rituals of blood purity. The registry revealed something chilling. At least one southern branch had remained isolated into the 1990s, resisting outside contact. This meant the doctrine had not only survived, but continued unbroken nearly a century after Thomas's disappearance. In 2018, recovered journals from one of Thomas's younger sons revealed even darker beliefs. He wrote of training his grandsons to expect supernatural powers from continued purity, convinced their bloodline was destined to transcend ordinary men. These writings showed how indoctrination evolved. What began as delusion about apocalypse had expanded into myths of divine transformation. Each generation added layers to the doctrine, ensuring loyalty through promises of eventual power. By 2021, DNA from genealogy websites uncovered another hidden community in Missouri. 50 men traced their lineage back to a mysterious settler from the 1950s named Thomas Wright. He matched the Blackwood pattern exactly. Though investigators found no abuse there, the community still emphasized family purity and resisted outside contact. This revealed a terrifying possibility. Some branches had sanitized the doctrine while quietly maintaining isolation and secrecy. The bloodline, then, had become a ghost network. Some branches were exposed, collapsing under law enforcement raids. Others remained hidden, mutating, adapting, surviving silently in forgotten corners of America. What began in a single farmhouse had grown into something sprawling. Thomas's doctrine had achieved what he desired: endurance beyond death, continuation across states, invisibility protected by silence and geography. The bloodline's survival forces uncomfortable questions. How many descendants remain hidden? How many still believe they are chosen? And how many carry the genetic scars of a doctrine designed to outlive its architect? For authorities, the greatest challenge is that Blackwood's legacy is diffuse. Unlike a single cult, it cannot be dismantled at once. Each branch must be found individually, each carrying its own mutations of the doctrine. The tragedy is that many descendants know nothing of their origins. They live ordinary lives, unaware their blood carries echoes of Thomas's madness. Yet hidden clusters remain, perpetuating rituals, training new generations for duties they never chose. The phrase, bloodlines without end, is no exaggeration. Thomas designed his doctrine to scatter like seeds across soil, each branch growing silently. Even today, investigators admit the true scale may never be fully uncovered. And so, the Blackwood story is not confined to history. It is living, breathing, continuing. Each new discovery proves Thomas succeeded in creating something disturbingly durable, a doctrine passed through generations like an inheritance. The bloodlines endure, hidden among hills, scattered across plains, whispered in rituals performed by sons who never met their patriarch but still obey his words. They are the continuation of a legacy that refuses to die. Bloodlines without end. That is Thomas Blackwood's greatest triumph and humanity's greatest tragedy. His empire was never built of stone, but of men indoctrinated to believe their blood carried divine purpose. And that empire still stands in shadows. Even after a century, the Blackwood story refuses to die. Its shadows still linger across the Appalachian wilderness, whispered about in taverns, recalled in half-forgotten family tales, and uncovered in disturbing genealogical records. For locals, the Blackwood name remains cursed. Some men lower their voices when discussing it, wary that acknowledging the past may stir something best left buried. Yet the echoes are too loud to ignore. Investigators who revisit the case often describe the same eerie feeling. The land itself feels heavier, as if carrying the weight of secrets buried beneath its soil. Silence in those hills feels unnatural. In 2015, researchers attempting to access sealed archives discovered files had been destroyed decades earlier in a suspicious fire. To them, it seemed as though someone deliberately erased records, preventing the full scope from surfacing. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, journalists exploring the case reported unusual resistance. Files disappeared, access was denied, and some received anonymous warnings urging them to abandon their work. Fear seemed to cling even generations later. Court documents later revealed why. Prominent families across West Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky bore distant connections to the Blackwood bloodline. The truth threatened reputations, wealth, and political legacies. Suppression was more convenient than exposure. But genetics told a different story. In the 1990s, researchers discovered unique markers tied to the lineage in hundreds of men across Appalachia. The evidence proved the bloodline had spread far wider than once imagined. Former FBI analyst Richard Torres estimated between 500 and 800 living descendants might exist in the United States today. Most would never know their origins, severed from memory yet bound by blood. Torres warned that isolated clusters could still exist, perpetuating Thomas's doctrine. He pointed out that remote communities often resisted oversight, providing fertile ground for secrecy. Silence was still the enemy, just as it had been in 1903. His analysis proved chillingly accurate. In 2005, authorities uncovered a compound in Idaho housing 37 men and boys. Its leader, calling himself Thomas Shepard, practiced rituals drawn directly from Blackwood's writings. DNA confirmed he was kin. This discovery reignited national attention, though briefly. Media headlines sensationalized the story, but soon it faded. For authorities, the case became a balancing act between public safety, privacy rights, and the haunting complexity of unraveling bloodlines. By 2008, a confidential registry was created to track genetic markers associated with the lineage. The aim was twofold: provide medical support and quietly monitor clusters that might suggest continued indoctrination. Anonymized reports published in 2015 identified over 300 confirmed descendants across 27 states. 3 branches showed signs of integrating into society. But one remained troublingly isolated, maintaining separation and secrecy until the 1990s. The existence of that branch raised terrifying questions. If one survived into modern decades, how many others had endured, undetected? How many still carried Thomas's words as gospel, waiting for an imagined apocalypse? Further confirmation arrived unexpectedly. In 2018, an anonymous package surfaced containing journals written by one of Thomas's youngest sons. Forensic testing confirmed their authenticity. They provided first-hand accounts of captivity and indoctrination spanning 4 decades. The journals revealed that after failed escape attempts, the boy remained imprisoned at a secondary property in North Carolina. He described the birth of dozens of descendants, many sent away to establish new branches. He also wrote of Thomas's growing delusions. In later years, the patriarch believed his bloodline would develop supernatural gifts, visions, strength, clarity. The promises bound his sons more tightly than chains, ensuring obedience beyond rational fear. His final entry, written shortly before his death in the 1950s, expressed despair. He admitted his failure to stop the doctrine and begged future readers to recognize the evil still spreading beyond his sight. The journals proved the doctrine had been actively sustained long after authorities believed Thomas was gone. They confirmed his obsession did not die with him. It adapted, carried forward by indoctrinated sons and grandsons. By 2021, genealogy databases revealed another unsettling discovery. A small Missouri community, descended from a settler named Thomas Wright, bore genetic markers identical to Blackwood's lineage. Around 50 men traced their ancestry directly to him. Though authorities documented no abuse, investigators noted the community's obsession with purity and resistance to outside contact. To historians, this was enough to suggest Thomas's doctrine continued, albeit in a quieter, adapted form. The persistence of these echoes demonstrates Thomas's success. He created not merely a cult, but a self-perpetuating system, one designed to adapt, scatter, and survive even against the scrutiny of law, medicine, and history itself. Experts argue this makes the Blackwood case uniquely horrifying. Most abusive family systems collapse within a generation, but Thomas engineered his to expand, ensuring his vision endured like a virus passed silently through bloodlines. The echoes are heard not only in isolated communities but in the medical field. Doctors treating descendants report rare disorders, congenital defects, and psychological trauma rooted in generational abuse and enforced isolation. Some descendants integrated into normal society struggle with identity. Discovering kinship to Thomas is like uncovering a curse. Men who thought themselves ordinary suddenly learn their bloodline was shaped by one man's madness. For many, the revelation brings shame, but for others, it brings defiance, a determination to break the cycle, to ensure Blackwood's legacy ends with them. They see themselves not as heirs, but as survivors. Historians emphasize that the Blackwood case is not only about one man's crimes, it is about community negligence, institutional failures, and the way silence allows horror to flourish unchecked across generations. One survivor summarized it bluntly. The worst part wasn't what he did. It was that men suspected and stayed quiet. Those words remain the most damning indictment of the Blackwood legacy. Silence built Thomas's empire. Silence allowed it to spread. And silence still haunts modern echoes as researchers face resistance from communities unwilling to acknowledge uncomfortable truths tied to their own bloodlines. As the farmhouse site sits overgrown and forgotten, locals whisper of strange sounds in the hills. Some claim singing drifts through the trees at night. Others insist it is weeping carried on the wind. No matter the truth, the symbolism remains potent. The echoes remind us that Thomas's influence was never confined to one time or place. It persists, scattered like embers that refuse to extinguish. For investigators, the Blackwood case remains officially open. New information continues to surface, whether through DNA databases, recovered documents, or whispered testimony from men who finally choose to speak. The search is far from over, and yet, the greatest terror lies not in what has been discovered, but in what remains hidden. How many branches still exist? How many sons live by his rules in silence? The echoes in the hills are not merely sounds. They are reminders. They remind us of what happens when men place power above justice, when communities choose ignorance, when silence becomes complicity. The Blackwood legacy endures as a warning. It shows how easily one man's delusion can outlive him, spreading across generations. It forces us to question how many similar shadows may exist, unseen, in forgotten corners today. As historians close their books, as agents file their reports, the truth remains chillingly unresolved. Somewhere, in some isolated hollow, the echoes of Thomas's vision may still be shaping the lives of men. And perhaps the most terrifying realization of all is this: the Blackwood case is not history alone. It is present. It is ongoing. It is alive in whispers, in bloodlines, in echoes that never fade. The hills of Appalachia still carry his shadow. Whether in rumor, ritual, or genetic inheritance, Thomas Blackwood's empire of silence continues to reverberate. And until every echo is silenced, his legacy endures. Echoes in the hills, that is where his presence survives. Not in monuments, not in graves, but in the living blood of men who carry his name unknowingly, and in the whispers of those who remember. The story ends not with resolution, but with uncertainty. Because in every whisper of wind, in every rumor of isolation, In every unexplained cluster of secrecy, the question remains, where do the echoes of Blackwood still hide?